right, music students. It's Mr. Roderick here in the music bunker, high atop Mount St. Clemens. And as you can probably tell by what I'm playing, today we are studying the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem. We're going to study how to sing it. We're going to study what the words or lyrics mean. And we're going to study the history of the Star Spangled Banner and why it was written. So, the first thing we have to do is travel back in time to 1814. So let's get our time machine hats on right now. I'll wait. Do you have your time machine hat on? We're going to go back in time. Here we go. Get ready. Here we go. Back in time. Here we are in 1814, and we are in the middle of a war against Britain, which is kind of weird because we just finished a war with Britain in 1783. What was that war? I'll give you a hint. It started in 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's right. It was the Revolutionary War. It's the war that turned our 13 original colonies of Britain into our own country, the United States of America. But now it's 38 years later, and Britain is still mad at us. And they keep messing with us. They do things like capture our American ships and take all the sailors off of the ships and make them work for the British ships. They were really being grumpy. So President James Madison decided to go to the war with Britain again. We called that war the War of 1812. Quick quiz. When did the War of 1812 start? That is correct, 1812. How in the world did you figure that out? The problem with the War of 1812, though, is that the British had the best ships, the best navy, the best equipped and most disciplined soldiers. They were a tough adversary. We almost lost that war. We almost had to go back and be colonies of Britain. In fact, during the War of 1812, the British were able to march right into Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, and burn it down. They burned down the White House, and they burned down the Capitol building, and it was really bad. So, by 1814, things were not looking good for our young country. After burning Washington, D.C. down, the British decided to go after Baltimore, which is really an important city just to the north of Washington, D.C. The U.S. fort in Baltimore was a fort called Fort McHenry. It is still there today. You can see it right here. First, the British tried to march on Fort McHenry, but that didn't work. So the British brought in the Navy. 16 ships, including some of the best ones in the British Navy, silently surrounded the American fort on September 13th, 1814. And then they just sat there in dread silence, reposing. As I said, the British Navy in the 1800s was the best navy in the world. They had the coolest ships. Look at this. It's just like the Pirates of the Caribbean. They had cannons and the best weapons. They even had a new invention, flaming cannonballs. They called them bombs back then. They would fill the cannonball with gunpowder, put a fuse in it, and fire the cannonball, which would burst in midair with a lot of light. Colonel Armistead, the commanding officer of Fort McHenry, had suspected for a while that the British would attack the fort. So long before the British invaded, he decided to have a couple of things done. He had 2 gigantic flags made, one bigger and one a little bit smaller, just to mess with the British so they could fly it over the fort. And he also got the townsfolk to build defenses around the city and block the harbor around the fort with derelict ships. And that's why, when the British came to Baltimore, they couldn't attack very well because the townsfolk had built a bunch of defenses on the land. But anyway, back to Colonel Armistead. He had asked Mary Pickersgill to sew flags, and she really went all out with about 7 of her friends. The bigger flag was 30 feet by 42 feet. It was a garrison flag. Here's how it looks today. Let's look at it. Now look at the stars. Our flag today has 50 stars in it. What do the 50 stars stand for? You are correct. The 50 states. But back in 1814, there were not 50 stars in the flag. How many were there? Count them, please. Did you count 14? Actually, some of you may have counted 15 because you figured there used to be a star where there's a hole right in the flag, and you are correct. There were 15 stars in the flag, and that means there were 15 states in our country. 2 more than the 13 original colonies. Nowadays, our flag has 13 stripes, but back then, can you count the stripes? Yep, there were 15 stripes. So nowadays, we have 13 stripes for our 13 original colonies, but we have 50 stars. But why is there a hole in the middle of the flag, you ask? Well, this is a mystery. Why do you think there's a hole in the middle of the Star Spangled Banner? Well, if you guessed that one of the bombs went right through the flag, that's a good guess, but that's not really what happened. What really happened is kind of weird. After the Battle of Baltimore, which is the battle we're talking about, Colonel Armistead, the colonel who ran the fort, got to keep that gigantic flag. And he kept it in his family. Sometimes they would break it out for celebrations around Baltimore or parades. But mostly he just passed it from generation to generation. And about the time of his grandson, somebody, we don't know who, started snipping little pieces of the flag off of the flag and giving it to friends. And somebody snipped a hole out of one of the stars and gave it to a friend. We still don't know where that star is. We don't know what happened to all the snips that were sent to people. But it seems like a rude thing to do. But you got to remember, the flag wasn't that famous back then. It really wasn't famous until 1931, and I'll tell you why later. Because right now we have to get back to Fort McHenry. Last time we left, the British ships had surrounded the fort in dread silence, just out of the range of the fort's cannons. And then the little doors on the sides of the ship opened. What's inside those little doors? You are correct. Those little doors are called gun ports, and inside there are cannons. And the British began firing on Fort McHenry in the rainy early morning of September 13th, and kept firing for 25 hours, all the way through the night, with bombs and rockets bursting in air. But wait, there's another part of the story we have to talk about. The British troops had captured an American doctor and were holding him captive. And a young 35-year-old lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key was asked by President Madison to negotiate for his release. On September 7th, long before the battle we're talking about happened, Key and a friend had to get on a boat and sail out to where the British ships were in Baltimore Harbor in dread silence. He negotiated with the British and got the doctor released, but he overheard the people on the ship talking about how they were going to attack the fort. And because he heard that, the people on the ship made him stay on the ship for many days. Now, Francis Scott Key had a cousin who was on the fort, and he was really worried about what was going to happen. But he had to stay on the ship and just watch. He couldn't do anything about it. So when September 13th came, he had to sit and watch and hope that the flag on the fort would not be lowered. What happens if a fort lowers its flag and puts up the enemy flag? Well, you're right. It means that we have surrendered. So, as the sun went down and twilight fell. Francis Scott Key watched. He was over a mile away from the fort, out in the bay on an enemy ship, looking through his little telescope. Occasionally, when the British bombs exploded over the fort, he could see that the gigantic flag was still flying. In the dawn of the next morning, when the sun came up, the rain had stopped, and Francis Scott Key could see that our flag was still flying over the fort. Colonel Armistead flew the smaller storm flag actually during the night and raised the big garrison flag in the early morning. And that's the gigantic flag that Francis Scott Key saw by the dawn's early light. He was so relieved and inspired by the sight, he started writing a poem about his experience on the back of a letter that he had with him. After he finished the poem later, there were 4 verses. The poem was published right away on September 20th in one of the Baltimore papers and became very popular. In the next video, we're going to take a look at what some of these old-fashioned words mean. But right now, let's just say the first 2 verses of this great poem and see if you can get a picture in your mind about what Francis Scott Key was trying to describe in this poem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that Star Spangled Banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shore dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. What is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Key's brother-in-law realized that the poem's words fit really well with a melody of a song that was popular at the time. The song was called To Anseron in Heaven, and it was actually about drinking wine. But once people started singing Francis Scott Key's words, it became a big hit. In 1917, John Philip Sousa, the famous brass band leader, helped write the version that we sing today. It was played and sung often at military events and patriotic concerts, and perhaps more importantly, during baseball games. But it wasn't until 1931 that President Herbert Hoover finally signed a bill making the Star-Spangled Banner our official national anthem. And that's the story of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, kids, the War of 1812 was not the most important war that we ever fought in our country. The Battle of Baltimore was not the most important battle we ever fought in our country. But it's interesting to study these stories. It's interesting to study history, and there's always so many cool stories that you can discover when you study history. In the next video, we're going to learn to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. We're going to learn all the words, and we're going to learn how to sing the high notes and the low notes. And by the end of it, you'll know all about the Star-Spangled Banner and how to sing it, so you can sing it at a baseball game. See you in the next video.